Hi guys, Miss Davis here, back for day 37 of the Anne Frank series. Today I want to jump right in where we left off yesterday, but like yesterday, I'm going to do a little skipping around. Some of the main themes that I'm looking for, of course, are news about the war and the front of the war and what's happening because D-Day was very recent, and then other things that sort of are familiar for us about the Diary of Anne Frank, her inner thoughts, and how much she feels like she's changed and how much she feels like she's grown and how much older she feels than she actually is, things like that. So a different balance between news of the war and news of Anne. So I'm going to jump right in to where we left off yesterday, Friday the 9th of June 1944. Dear Kitty, super news of the invasion. The Allies have taken Bayeux, a small village on the French coast, and are now fighting for Caen. It's obvious that they intend to cut off the peninsula where Cherbourg lies. Every evening war correspondents give news from the battlefront, telling us of the difficulties, courage, and enthusiasm of the army. They manage to get hold of the most incredible stories. Also, some of the wounded who are already back in England came again to the microphone. The Air Force are up all the time in spite of the miserable weather. We heard over the BBC that Churchill wanted to land with the troops on D-Day. However, Eisenhower and the other generals managed to get him out of the idea. Just think of it. What pluck he has for such an old man. He must be 70 at least. And then I'm going to skip a couple of paragraphs of this journal entry. She goes on to talk about a pianist that they've all been reading a book about, which I'm going to skip. I think that it's interesting that she's got this real love of Winston Churchill, and she really sort of admires the man. Every time she mentions him, it's complimentary. So there's that, and then there's the idea that the bombardments and the fighter planes and the jets are in the air constantly, even in bad weather, and I mean it's the siege. I'm going to skip now to Tuesday the 13th of June 1944. Dear Kitty, another birthday has gone by, so now I'm 15. I received a lot of presents. All 5 parts of Springer History of Art, a set of underwear, a handkerchief, 2 bottles of yogurt, a pot of jam, a spiced gingerbread cake, and a book on botany from Mummy and Daddy, a double bracelet from Margot, a book from the Van Dans, sweet peas from Dussel, sweets and exercise books from Meep and Ely, and high spot of all, the book Maria Theresa and 3 slices of full cream cheese from Krahler. A lovely bunch of peonies from Peter. The poor boy took a lot of trouble to try and find something, but didn't have any luck. Still, there's excellent news of the invasion. In spite of the wretched weather, countless gales, heavy rains, and high seas. Yesterday, Churchill, Smuts, Eisenhower, and Arnold visited French villages which have been conquered and liberated. The torpedo boat that Churchill was in shelled the coast. He appears, like so many men, not to know what fear is. Makes me envious. It's difficult for us to judge from Marsica Redu how people outside have reacted to the news. Undoubtedly, the people are pleased that the idle English have rolled up their sleeves and are doing something at last. Any Dutch people who still look down on the English, scoff at England and her government of old gentlemen, call the English cowards and yet hate the Germans, deserve a good shaking. Perhaps it would put some sense into their woolly brains. I hadn't had a period for over 2 months, but it finally started again on Saturday. Still, in spite of all the unpleasantness and bother, I'm glad it hasn't failed me any longer. Yours, Anne. So that's what I'm talking about. So it's my birthday. I got these presents. All of this news about the war. And oh, by the way, ladies' days. So isn't this the way that young people see the world just so funny sometimes? They hold in equal importance these things that affect their normal everyday lives, uh, along with huge world events. And so sometimes, especially during coronavirus quarantine, I've been feeling that sometimes the mundane, everyday stuff really is just as important as the stuff that's happening out there because it's so far removed. And so I guess to get where she's coming from a little bit. Next journal entries, Wednesday the 14th of June, 1944. Dear Kitty, my head is haunted by so many wishes and thoughts, accusations and reproaches. I'm really not as conceited as so many people seem to think. I know my own faults and shortcomings better than anyone, but the difference is that I also know that I want to improve, shall improve, and have already improved a great deal. Why is it then, I so often ask myself, that everyone still thinks I'm so terribly knowing and forward? Am I so knowing? Is it that I really am, or that maybe the others aren't? It sounds queer, I realize now, but I shan't cross out the last sentence because it really isn't so crazy. Everyone knows that Mrs. Van Daan, one of my chief accusers, is unintelligent. I may as well put it plainly and say stupid. Stupid people usually can't take it if others do better than they do. Mrs. Van Daan thinks I'm stupid because I'm not quite so lacking in intelligence as she is. She thinks I'm forward because she's even more so. She thinks my dresses are too short because hers are even shorter. And that's also the reason that she thinks I'm knowing, because she's twice as bad about joining in over subjects she knows absolutely nothing about. But one of my favorite is, there's no smoke without fire. And I readily admit that I am knowing. Now, the trying part about me is that I criticize and scold myself far more than anyone else does. Then if Mummy adds her bit of advice, the pile of sermons becomes so insurmountable that in my despair I become rude and start contradicting, and then the old well-known Anne watchword comes back. No one understands me. This phrase sticks in my mind. I know it sounds silly, yet there is some truth in it. I often accuse myself to such an extent that I simply long for a word of comfort, for someone who could give me sound advice and also draw out some of my real self. But alas, I keep on looking, but I haven't found anyone yet. I know that you'll immediately think of Peter, won't you? But it's like this. Peter loves me, not as a lover, but as a friend, and grows more affectionate every day. But what's the mysterious thing that holds us both back? I don't understand it myself. Sometimes I think that my terrible longing for him was exaggerated. Yet that's really not it, because if I don't go up to see him for 2 days, then I long for him more desperately than ever before. Peter is good, and he's a darling, but there's still no denying that there is a lot about him that disappoints me. Especially his dislike of religion and all his talk about food and various other things. It doesn't appeal to me. Yet I feel quite convinced that we shall never quarrel now that we've made that straightforward agreement together. Peter is a peace-loving person. He's tolerant and gives in very easily. He lets me say a lot of things to him that he would never accept from his mother. He tries most persistently to keep his things in order, and yet why should he keep his innermost self to himself? And why am I never allowed there? By nature he's more closed up than I am, I agree, but I know, and from my own experience, that at some time or the other, even the most uncommunicative people long just as much, if not more, to find someone in whom they can confide. Both Peter and I have spent our most meditative years in the secret annex. We often discuss the future, the past, and the present, but, as I've already said, I still seem to miss the real thing. And yet, I know that it's there. Yours, Anne. So this is sort of a common theme with her and Peter, that, she likes him, and, they even talk about love and things of that nature, but the fact of the matter is that she doesn't really feel like he knows the real her, and she gets the feeling that she doesn't know the real him in return, and that there's like something between, a barrier between the two of them that, might have a lot to do with living in such a terribly volatile and hard time. I mean, I can't help but thinking that maybe if they were in different circumstances, first of all, maybe they would date other people. Maybe they would, not be choosing to be with one another because there would be other things to do, other places to go, other people to see. But as it is, they're there quarantined. Well, not quarantined, but in hiding together, and it's there's no one else to hang out with. And they are very, very, very good friends when they tell each other everything. So there's intimacy there, but still not really like a deep sense of knowing. He was too young, or longing for something that, would be real when really it's kind of maybe artificial. But that's familiar old Anne. She's been struggling with that for many, many pages. Next journal entry is Thursday, the 15th of June, 1944. Dear Kitty, I wonder if it's because I haven't been able to poke my nose outdoors for so long that I've grown so crazy about everything to do with nature. I can perfectly well remember that there was a time when a deep blue sky, the song of birds, moonlight, and flowers could never have kept me spellbound. But that's changed since I've been here. At Whitsun, for instance, when it was so warm I stayed awake on purpose until 11:30 one evening in order to have a good look at the moon for once by myself. Alas, the sacrifice was all in vain, as the moon gave far too much light, and I didn't dare risk opening the window. Another time, some months ago, I happened to be upstairs one evening when the window was open. I didn't go downstairs until the window had to be shut. The dark, rainy evening, the gale, the scudding clouds held me entirely in their power. It was the first time in a year and a half that I had seen the night face to face. After that evening my longing to see it again was greater than my fear of burglars, rats, and raids on the house. I went downstairs all by myself and looked outside through the windows in the kitchen and the private office. A lot of people are fond of nature. Many sleep outdoors occasionally, and people in prisons and hospitals long for the day when they will be free to enjoy the beauties of nature. But few are so shut away and isolated from that which can be shared alike by rich and poor. It's not imagination on my part when I say that I look up at the sky. The clouds, the moon, and the stars makes me calm and patient. It's a better medicine than either valerian or bromine. Mother Nature makes me humble and prepared to face every blow courageously. Alas, it has had to be that I am only able, except on a few rare occasions, to look at nature through dirty net curtains hanging before very dusty windows, and it's no pleasure looking through these any longer because nature is just one thing that really must be unadulterated. Yours, Anne. So Anne has really, she's been here before, she's said this before, she always has appreciated nature, but in this journal entry, she's never been so straightforward about her need to go outside. It's been 2 years that she's been outside and felt the sun on her skin and the wind in her hair, and where I live, nature's quite omnipresent. It's everywhere. It's beautiful, and there's certain times of year or certain days there's a smell that this hits you, and it's the smell of spring or the smell of fall or the smell of rainy day, and it's wonderful. So if you're lucky enough wherever you are to be able to go outside, maybe Anne Frank is inspiring me today to get your buns out there and enjoy nature, even if it's not perfect, because it's good for the soul. Next journal entry, Friday the 16th of June, 1944. Dear Kitty, new problems. Mrs. Van Daan is desperate. Talks about a bullet through her head, prison, hanging, and suicide. She's jealous that Peter confides in me and not her. She's offended that Dussel doesn't enter into her flirtations with him, as she'd hoped. Afraid that her husband is smoking all the fur coat money away. She quarrels, uses abusive language, cries, pities herself, laughs, and then starts a fresh quarrel again. What on earth can one do with such a foolish, blubbering specimen? No one takes her seriously. She hasn't any character, and she grumbles to everyone. The worst of it is that it makes Peter rude, Mr. Van Daan irritable, and Mummy cynical. Yes, it's a frightful situation. There's one golden rule to keep before you. Laugh about everything and don't bother yourself about the others. It sounds selfish, but it's honestly the only way for anyone who has to seek consolation in himself. Kraetler has received another call-up to go digging for 4 weeks. He's trying to get out of it with a doctor's certificate and a letter from the business. Kufius wants to have an operation on his stomach. All private telephones were cut off at 11 o'clock yesterday. Yours, Anne. Okay, so this is a quick little journal entry, and I know she's complained about Mrs. Van Daan this whole time. She's driven her nuts this whole time, but I'm actually kind of a little bit worried about Mrs. Van Daan. Her talk, her constant agitation, her high state of anxiety. I'm sort of worried about Mrs. Van Daan's mental health a little bit, I'm going to be quite frank. She has to be just as, wanting to go outside as anybody else, and I know Anne says that you should, don't worry about other people and laugh about everything, but I'm wondering what would happen if a little bit of, kindness and a little bit of, are you okay? If that might make a difference with Mrs. Van Daan. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. You'd be surprised how much kindness and empathy can go a long way too. So those are my thoughts for today. See you tomorrow.